Okay, perfect. So yeah, I've been doing some medical education stuff at King's, where I was a student, where I did, my medical degree as well. And I guess that as I've moved through medical school and as I now am sort of navigating my role and positionality of being a clinician, I've become really interested in how the thinking that's sort of happening at the intersection of the biomedical, the social, the political and the philosophical can be sort of practically and clinically operationalized in the everyday work of being doctors and being medical educators. And one of the ways in which I have explored that interest is through Structure in the Clinic, which is a pursuit that I started with my friend and colleague, Natasha Chilambo, in September 2020. So Natasha and I were at medical school together here at King's, as I said, and after our third year, we both took a year out to do a master's, Natasha in leadership and development at the African Leadership Centre, and myself at the Centre for Multicultural and Interdisciplinary Inquiry at UCL in the PPE of health. And I guess Structure in the Clinic was what grew out of us wanting to share with our peers at medical school the ideas and the thinking that we'd encountered in this year, because they had really transformed and expanded the way that we thought about health and illness, but also the way that we wanted to practice care and the way that we wanted to be doctors in the future. So I guess through Structure in the Clinic, what we hope to do is promote and contribute to critical discussions around the structural forces that shape our health. And we're committed to doing this in an intersectional, multidisciplinary and transcultural way. And I guess the reason we want to do it in those ways is because we think that's the most epistemically just way of teaching medicine. And I guess I'll talk a little bit more about how we've been trying to do that and how we've been tracing a path towards that a little bit later on. So at medical school, they do talk to us about the social determinants of health and medical ethics. Not nearly enough, but they do talk to us about it, and it does form a part of the curriculum. But what we found is there's such a disconnect between what we're taught, the teaching, and how that actually affects patient care, how that actually affects the lives of the people that we interact with every day. And so we wanted to sort of think about how can we better operationalize the teaching in clinical medicine. So we found that the teaching is often fragmented and siloed. It's often tagged on to the end of the biomedical conception as a cursory afterthought. And it's also very didactic in nature rather than discursive. And I guess we were wondering, does it make sense to talk about kidneys and nephrons and electrolytes in the same way and teach that in the same way as teaching institutional racism that contributes to the inappropriate use of race in clinical algorithms? I'm talking about like EGFR calculations. Can we talk about these two things in the same way? Because they're fundamentally quite different things. So perhaps they should be taught in quite fundamentally different ways. So I guess the latter, the conversations around race as a social construct, the way that race plays out in these clinical algorithms in our clinical practice, structural racism, coloniality of medical knowledge, all of these things require more discussion, require more unpacking, and not the prescriptive kind of learning that medical school is often full of. And that requires space, it requires energy, it requires money and resources, and it also requires fundamentally a different type of lexicon. And I think that that's something that we found has been lacking within our personal experience of the medical curriculum. So I brought up this visualization that we often have used in some of the teaching sessions that we've done to sort of reconceptualize how we could think about health and illness. So often in our teaching, there'll be a broad brush statement that's made where we say race and class are factors that impact one's risk of developing severe asthma, for example. But it doesn't go further and encourage us to ask, why is that? And sort of interrogate that question of why, but it just stops at the what. And even when it does ask why, it often spotlights individualism, such as lifestyle choices or genetic factors. So when we're taught about asthma, the teaching rarely integrates these sort of outer circles that we've illustrated here. It doesn't integrate the racialized politics of space or of pollution inequity or historical disinvestment in working class neighborhoods. It doesn't talk about, where do we build large roads that lots of traffic go through, which neighborhoods do we build them in, which neighborhoods do we invest in cleaning, or which neighborhoods do we kind of dump our waste in. And all of this is actually very fundamental to the pathogenesis of asthma, but we're not encouraged to think about it in that way. So I guess we've kind of illustrated it here in this way to try and move away from this linear thinking of cause and effect towards more layered, interconnected models of how illness comes about, and by extension, how healing comes about. And I think it also encourages this sort of intersectional and multidisciplinary thought, because it decenters doctors and it decenters biomedical interventions and says, discrete biomedical interventions that target, bronchoconstriction in the lungs is not the answer. Policymakers and artists and community organizers and philosophers and all of these people need to be involved in the conversation about how can we, provide care and provide the process of healing or support the process of healing. And I guess we always say on this idea of radical imagination, we would love it if there was a future in which medical textbooks had these kinds of visualizations of illness and conceptualizations of illness rather than what we have at the moment. So going back to structure in the clinic and the kind of teaching that we've been doing, this is sort of just a slide that shows like the different kind of sources of knowledge that we have been kind of drawing on. So I've included some of the sources that we've tried to draw on to practice this idea of play that I kind of started off with. So within the context of learning and expanding our current framings and understandings of health, we think that drawing on, music from the Sons of Kemet and Sarathi Korwar and collage artists like Asma Aswani and poetry and Michaela Cole's, I May Destroy You, scenes from that, and Aga Noor's short film, Birth Control Your Own Adventure, like all of these things are things that have like fundamentally informed how we kind of think about care and practicing medicine. And what we wanted to do is sort of bring these to medical students and medical practitioners. And when we did that, what kind of we used this as a stimulus piece, and we tried to draw out themes that we could then apply to medicine, that we could apply to the care that we practice. So what happens when we draw on these artists and thinkers to inform what we teach our medical students? We think it cultivates an educational culture that helps us learn how to raise questions while also teaching us how to answer them. It's an opportunity to reconfigure our sort of collective mental infrastructure and to imagine beyond the current paradigm. It offers like a unit of measurement of our aspirations in metrics that are not accessible through the current kind of paradigm of thinking. And it enables us to access with compassion what is another person's reality, our patient's reality, but through our imagination. And I guess this is what we are conceptualizing as play. So yeah, how are we conceptualizing play as a practice that can be practically harnessed to make medical education more fair and more just? So we're thinking of it as a resistance, as a rebellion, and as a sort of disruption of a system that overvalues biomedical objectivity. And it's overvaluing this objectivity at the cost of violently erasing sort of complex and textured ontologies, histories, and stories from mainly marginalized and minoritized people and their sources of knowledge. So I was thinking about this violence and kind of took me back to sort of Galton's definition of violence as the cause of the difference between the potential and the actual, between what is and what could be. And I think that if we think about this kind of framing of violence in the context of medical education, it makes me think of like all the different narratives and all the alternative epistemologies that have been excluded and with their exclusion, we've lost their potentiality that they hold to kind of provide better care and relate to our patients in like a more effective way, especially our most vulnerable and marginalized patients. So I guess to us, how we're defining play is it's sort of practicing fluidity in the face of very rigid clinical protocols and research methodologies and teaching practices. It's kind of employing a more contemplative, slow, interpretive approach rather than this reductive, didactic approach in our learning and our teaching. And it's measuring progress and success in like medical education in units of safety, belonging, collective joy and well-being, rather than units of sort of extractive productivity, numbers and efficiency. And I guess that's the imagination that and the aspiration that we have for medical education as well as clinical practice. Priming medical students to be more curious, priming doctors to be more curious, to approach alternative forms of knowledge with this curiosity and with this humility, rather than with sort of distrust and dismissiveness, as we often find that we do within clinical medicine. And as a result, we hope that such a perspective can sort of unshackle pedagogy and move away from this idea that knowledge production is something that has to happen within a textbook or within the four walls of a lecture theatre, where we can kind of think about, I've put up this picture here of a gig in Deptford, Steam Down, and we kind of say that, you know, where listening to jazz and dancing in the middle of like this sweaty crowd can be like an opportunity to learn, and it can be an opportunity to inform the way that we practice caregiving. And interconnected with this idea of play is this idea of valorizing feeling. And I think that this is something that's often like immediately rejected in medicine and especially clinical medicine. And the argument made for that is it's harmful. It's harmful to our patients to feel. We need to be objective and we need to be sort of clinical and aseptic in our approach to these things. But I think that in that rebellious play, we could kind of, you know, go against that again and say, you know, no, feeling is important. And I think it makes us think that the current paradigm of medical education stunts the fullness of how we might understand health and how we might reimagine care, because it devalues the importance of the narrative and the experiential, not just of our patients, but of ourselves within this knowledge ecosystem. And in doing so, it stops us from working towards equitable provision of care. So I guess here with this quote, what we're kind of thinking about is perhaps it makes more sense to do the feeling, and then the feeling is the source and the stimulus that leads us towards the thinking and the doing. If we didn't sort of feel rage or, you know, frustration at the clinical scenarios that we encounter every day when we see the suffering of, you know, patients under a system that is oppressive and doesn't quite work, then maybe we wouldn't feel compelled to seek out theories and music and maths and statistics and whatever it might be to kind of understand that system, understand, you know, the cause of that frustration and understand how we can oppose that and better it, I guess. And I think that another thing that we're kind of talking about with this valorizing of feeling is that these systems of oppression tend to work to disconnect us, and they work to separate the idea of environmental justice from racial justice, from health justice, and it all seems like separate, unconnected, disconnected things. And I think that because all of these things make us feel sort of the same thing, so I think it's a way of practicing intersectionality and interconnectedness and opposing that tactic of distraction and shifting the focus away from the individual towards the systemic. So yeah, I guess the valorizing of feeling is like this idea that our feeling is the source and stimulus for our imagination, and the idea that our current imagination is based on the imagination of a very, very narrow few, the people who have been afforded the capacity to imagine because they sort of have the basic resources, such as, you know, being able to rest and have shelter and have food and, you know, live free lives. That has given them the capacity to imagine. So not everyone has had access to this. So we need to create an infrastructure in which everyone can be afforded this capacity and freedom to imagine. And this is an infrastructure that we imagine to be invitational and participatory, and hold our interdependence as people, and hold the fact that, you know, we owe each other things. Recognize the fact that we kind of owe each other joy and dignity and care, and recognize that we're not working in sort of isolation. We're not imagining and aspiring for things in isolation, but that our kind of aspirations are so intrinsically connected. And also an infrastructure that redefines what we understand by power. So often when we think of power, it's defined as sort of economic power or political power, but to redefine that and say, actually, power can come from like tending to our feelings and tending to our hearts, and sort of metrics of power and progress that center around what brings us joy and what nourishes us, and what are the barriers in reaching that joy and nourishment, and taking this as the starting point to ask sort of what if, and keep asking what if, and being able to ask what if without the institution having this sort of knee-jerk back to us with but, or but then, you know. So this slide has art from Toyin Odutola. She had an exhibition at the Barbican, which was just so great, and it kind of complicates the identity of Blackness, and it disrupts the sort of white imagination of framing Blackness as simply a racial demarcation, and opens it up to this sort of mythology and fluidity and fullness of life. And that in itself is like, you know, that having that capacity not only to imagine a different physical world around us, but reimagine our identity ourselves, and like reclaim like the imagination of what matters most to us. And it reminded me, as I was looking at those pictures, of something that the curator of the Black Imagination exhibition, Natasha Marin, said, which is that the Black imagination, we're not obligated, in the Black imagination, we're not obligated to how others see us. To get to the Black imagination, there's only one direction, it's inside. And that goes back to the sort of interconnectedness of, you know, valorizing that feeling and using that as a vessel towards this sort of radical imagination. And it transported me back to Audre Lorde's essay, which I had up on the previous slide, and saying that tending to our deepest feelings and desires and our sort of ancestral histories and stories is our stimulus for reimagining and redefining and repatterning. And we might not know exactly what that looks like yet, but that's quite an exciting place to be in medical education, because it's an opportunity to say, you know, we're at the very cusp of that imagination, and we need to collectivize to create space, both physically and mentally, to sort of travel towards that. And part of doing that is, you know, creating this infrastructure in which more people can be included in that journey, and more people can have access to sort of the freedom to, you know, imagine beyond the current metrics by which we define sort of progress and success within medicine. So on this slide, I've just got sort of a variety of different sources that has kind of from different people and different podcasts and events that have sort of contributed to my thinking around this. And I just sort of wanted to share them because I think that they've been really sort of thrilling to listen to, and I can obviously share it with the organisers so that you can sort of experience them yourselves as well. But yeah, I guess I would kind of say that not only our goals, but also the tools with which we pave the path towards those goals are currently constructed within the contours of what we already know and what we know in the here and now. And what we're kind of trying to do at Structure in the Clinic is posit that with radical imagination, we can construct our goals and set our aspirations for what is on metrics of what is needed to be known in the future. So there's sort of a continuum between the future and the present. And we have this idea of we're starting from the future and we're thinking about what do we need in the future. And that's our starting point of where we sort of do all the thinking. And yeah, I guess that is pretty much everything that I had to say. So yeah, if you have any questions.